Women and minorities and how they're going to basically participate in the American Revolution. So firstly, we got to look at women. The thing is, women are going to accompany men on both sides in the army. So this is the British Army as well as the American Continental Army. Their relationship to the men, sometimes these women would be prostitutes, but most of the time they were actually either married or at least common law consorts of the soldiers. A lot of times they performed a lot of jobs, such as like cooking and washing for the troops, but occasionally they're going to even help load like artillery and they're really going to provide a lot of the nursing care. Of course, the most famous woman from the American Revolution is from folklore, and that is the story of Molly Pitcher. Now, Molly Pitcher supposedly heroically carried water to gunners to cool the guns down and cool down the actual men working the guns at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 1778. Now, there's a really great story, a woman getting involved, fighting for patriotism and everything, and you can see these images here of Molly Pitcher, but quite frankly, this never happened. It was folklore. However, generally speaking, when you're looking at folklore, it's based off of true stories. So who exactly is Molly Pitcher based off of? Well, she was really based off of quite a few different women, though if you were looking for a specific woman, it was probably one of two women during the American Revolution. Now, the first woman is Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay. The thing is, she is not remembered until, she's not discovered by the American people as supposedly being Molly Pitcher until 1830. So this is like 52 years after. The thing is, what we know about Mary Ludwig Hayes is that she was never celebrated while she was alive, but we do know she was present at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, and she actually received a pension for services rendered and a private's half pay. So the fact that the Army paid her after the fact tells us she did something, most likely at that battle, but we don't know what. What we do know is that 50 years after the war and everything, there's this memory of one man who was present at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, who his name was Joseph Plum Martin. And the thing is, he has this memory of a woman who was firing artillery at Monmouth, but notice there's nothing about water in his memory. So his memory goes as follows. While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case it might have carried away something else. The thing is, we don't know if this was Mary Ludwig Hayes, but there is a good chance it was. And if it wasn't, it was another woman doing something. But really, more than anything else, this is presenting this woman who was present at the battle really as a butt end of a joke. Now, the other woman that may have been the supposed, Molly Pitcher is Margaret Corbin. Now, the thing that we know about Margaret Corbin is that she was present at Fort Washington, the Battle of Fort Washington on November 16th of 1776. But we don't really know what happened. All we know is that she was wounded there and she received a lifetime pension from the Army. So once again, documentation is very scarce. However, when people looked into her during the 1800s, it turns out the nickname, Margaret Corbin went by Captain Molly for the rest of her life. And if you haven't picked this up, Molly's actually a nickname for Mary and Margaret during this time period. But the other nickname that she had was Dirty Kate, and she died of syphilis, which tells us something probably about her profession in the ensuing years after the American Revolution or during the American Revolution. So it tells us something about these women, and that's what I want you to actually answer. On your journal, I want you to answer this question. What do we learn about women of this time period from this myth? What do we learn about like women's actions, but also what do we learn about how they were viewed or what their role was, so to speak? So go ahead and pause that if you wanted to answer it right now. I'll give you a few seconds. There's also other minorities, though, that participated in the Revolutionary War as well. So, for instance, African Americans are going to participate in the war on both sides of the conflict. For instance, in 1779, the British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, is going to basically promise to allow all those enslaved who fled from rebel owners to join the royal troops to follow any occupation they wished. Now, quite frankly, this was a hedged promise. They aren't going to allow those, they're not going to allow enslaved who have emancipated themselves and fled from the American colonies to do anything they want. But news spread very quickly about this, so much so that late in the war, enough Black people had flocked to the British Army, understandably trying to free themselves, that it was actually really hard to feed and house all of them. On top of that, the British, they did share a lot of the racial prejudices that Americans had at this time. And so generally the British were reluctant to arm these self-emancipated former enslaved people. And so instead, the British would basically put them to work as like agricultural or construction workers. But we do see a few Black British mounted troops seeing combat in like South Carolina. There's actually quite a few historians that argue that this promise of freedom for those who were enslaved was such a huge kick to the economic system that was huge in the Southern colonies, that's actually what brought the Southern colonies really into the fold and fighting for the American freedom, because they wanted to keep enslaving African Americans. The other side, though, we see about 5,000 African Americans are going to fight against the British and for American independence. Hundreds of them would actually be within the Continental Army. Many of them would be freedmen from like Massachusetts and Rhode Island. However, the idea of like any kind of army of African Americans is not well received in the South. If you ever watch certain movies like The Patriot, there's this whole thing about, that Washington will free a slave if they join the rebellion. That is not true. That did not happen. Freeing those who were enslaved at this time to join in the cause really was more on the British side, and sometimes at the different colonial level, but really only in the North, not in the South. And then the last group of minorities that participated in the war are Native Americans. The thing is, Native Americans that were east of the Mississippi River, and thus in the so-called British Empire, if they were asked, generally speaking, they would have preferred to be neutral in this conflict. However, their skills and their manpower were extremely valuable to both the American side and the British side, and both sides are going to look for their assistance. So when they were forced to choose, generally speaking, Native Americans would prefer to join the British side because they hoped that the British officials might protect them against white incursions, as so many white Americans had moved further and further, west into their territory. Now, occasionally, in some cases, the pressure to choose a side would produce splits within Native American groups, that some would want to join the British and some would join the American side. And other times you actually see the opposite. In fact, like in the area of the Ohio Valley River, you see this, that it actually promotes greater unity amongst different Native American groups, so they all come together on one particular side in the conflict. For the groups that were in the Ohio Valley River area, they actually joined the British in particular. We also have 3 phases of the war, so we're going to go into the actual warfare now. The thing is, don't write down this slide every single word. This is just so that you can kind of see the three different parts of this war. The first phase, we've already covered some of it, 1775 through 77. You can see where it's taking place mostly. You could technically break up this first phase into two, that's pre-declaring independence and post-declaration of independence. Then the second phase of the war is going to be 1778 through 81. This is when we start seeing, this is France entering the war, and we're going to see more fighting at sea and more fighting in the south. And then the third phase of the war is 1781 through 83. In retrospect, there's very little fighting and the American victory is assured. You have to keep in mind, though, that the people that were living in this time didn't know that yet. And then, of course, we're going to get the Peace of Paris in 1783 that will end the Revolutionary War.